Imagine the roar of a telecom titan crumbling in slow motion. One man, a self-made millionaire turned CEO, stares down a courtroom, his empire of fiber optic dreams exposed as a house of cards built on $11 billion in cooked books, shattering investor trust and wiping out $180 billion in market value overnight. A fraud so colossal, it redefined corporate greed. And even in 2025, its echoes still rattle boardrooms from Wall Street to Silicon Valley, reminding us that the ghosts of WorldCom never truly fade. To understand the fraud that defined an era, we have to step back to the wild, wired 90s, when the internet was exploding and telecom stocks were the hottest ticket on the exchange, promising endless growth in a digital gold rush that turned nobodies into billionaires overnight. Bernard "Bernie" Ebbers, a former basketball coach and motel owner from Mississippi, stumbled into this frenzy almost by accident. In 1983, he co-founded LDDS, a long-distance reseller scraping by in the shadows of AT&T's dominance. But with a gambler's instinct and a folksy charm that masked a ruthless ambition, Ebbers transformed it into WorldCom by the mid-90s through a frenzy of 60-plus acquisitions, gobbling up rivals like MFS Communications and SkyTel for stock swaps that ballooned the company from a $150 million outfit to a $180 billion behemoth by 1999. WorldCom wasn't just a phone company, it was the backbone of the booming web, laying thousands of miles of fiber optic cable across America and beyond, touting itself as the premier global telecommunications provider, with Ebbers as its cowboy CEO, complete with a 104,000-acre ranch in Canada, where he'd host executives for fly fishing retreats that blurred the line between business and bonhomie. Investors ate it up. WorldCom's stock soared from $3 to $64 a share, making Ebbers a paper billionaire worth $1.4 billion at its peak, and the company a darling of Wall Street analysts who couldn't praise its synergies enough. But beneath the hype, cracks were forming. The dot-com bubble was bursting by 2000. Telecom demand tanked as overbuilt networks sat idle, and WorldCom's debt ballooned to $41 billion, while revenues flatlined. Desperate to keep the stock afloat and secure his personal loans backed by shares, Ebbers turned to the one tool sharper than any merger: deception on a ledger scale. The fraud itself was a slow-burning catastrophe that ignited in 1999 and raged unchecked until mid-2002, when WorldCom's house of inflated assets finally imploded in one of the largest accounting scandals in U.S. history, second only to Enron in its audacity and fallout. It started subtly, as these things often do, with pressure from the top. Ebbers, facing a plummeting stock price that threatened his $400 million in personal loans from the company, demanded quarterly earnings beats to prop up shares and his own fortune, telling finance chief Scott Sullivan in no uncertain terms that missing Wall Street targets was not an option. What unfolded was a systematic $11 billion overstatement of assets, achieved by reclassifying everyday operating expenses, like line costs for leasing network capacity from other carriers, as long-term capital investments, which under accounting rules could be depreciated slowly over years rather than expensed immediately, juicing reported profits and cash flow to paint a picture of relentless growth. This wasn't a one-off tweak. It was a quarterly ritual of manipulation, with internal memos later revealed showing Sullivan's team cooking books to the tune of $3.8 billion in 2001 alone, turning projected losses into phantom gains that kept analysts like Jack Grubman at Salomon Smith Barney gushing about WorldCom's unparalleled execution. The deception snowballed. Executives hid the schemes from auditors Arthur Anderson, Enron's fallen gatekeeper, using off-balance sheet entities and verbal assurances to bypass red flags, while Ebbers maintained plausible deniability with his big-picture CEO persona, claiming ignorance of the details even as he pocketed $1.5 million in salary and bonuses tied to the fudged numbers. By April 2002, as whistleblower Cynthia Cooper's internal audit team uncovered the rot, staying late nights poring over ledgers that screamed foul, WorldCom confessed, filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy with $107 billion in assets, the largest in U.S. history at the time, vaporizing pensions for 30,000 employees, erasing $180 billion in shareholder value, and triggering a market panic that shaved $1.7 trillion off the Dow Jones over months. Ebbers was convicted in 2005 on securities fraud and conspiracy charges, sentenced to 25 years in a federal prison where he died of cancer in 2022. But the scars linger. The scandal birthed the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, mandating CEO sign-offs on financials and beefing up auditor independence. Yet in 2025, it's clear those reforms haven't slain the dragon entirely. Now, to peel back the layers on how Ebbers and his inner circle pulled off this $11 billion sleight of hand, we have to dive into the gritty mechanics of accounting wizardry gone wrong, a blueprint of fraud so elegant in its simplicity that it exposed the flimsy guardrails of corporate finance at the turn of the millennium. It all hinged on exploiting the arcane rules of generally accepted accounting principles, GAAP, specifically the distinction between capital expenditures, investments in assets like fiber cables that generate future revenue and can be amortized over time, and operating expenses, which must be deducted immediately to reflect true costs. WorldCom's telecom business was drowning in the former's cousin, massive line costs, the fees paid to other carriers for access to their networks, which routinely ate up 40 to 50% of revenues and should have been expensed right away to show the company's razor-thin margins. But starting in the second quarter of 1999, under Sullivan's direction and with Ebbers' implicit green light, finance teams in Clinton, Mississippi began a quarterly ritual of reclassification. They'd comb through vendor invoices and general ledgers, arbitrarily shifting billions from operating lines to capital accounts, with journal entries justified by flimsy memos claiming the costs enhanced network value or extended asset life, pure fiction, as no actual capital projects backed them up. This wasn't pencil-pushing sloppiness, it was deliberate, with Sullivan personally approving $500 million in bogus shifts in one quarter alone, using Excel spreadsheets and internal software to bury the adjustments in a sea of legitimate entries, making them invisible to casual reviews. To cover tracks, they leaned on verbal overrides with Arthur Andersen auditors, who, incentivized by $52 million in annual fees, accepted Sullivan's reassurances without demanding third-party confirmations or digging into the underlying docs. In one infamous exchange, Andersen partner Don Fisher waved off concerns, later testifying he trusted WorldCom's integrity despite glaring inconsistencies. As the stakes rose, the fraud escalated. By 2001, with the telecom crash deepening, they accelerated depreciation schedules on real assets to free up more capital room for fake shifts, and even dipped into reserves to smooth earnings, all while Ebbers leaned on his board, stacked with loyalists like former MCI chief Burt Roberts, for rubber stamp approvals on massive stock buybacks that propped up the share price. The house of cards teetered when Cooper's audit crew, armed with a tip from a worried VP and sheer tenacity, cross-referenced line cost reports against capital budgets in May 2002, uncovering $3.055 billion in unsupported entries that ballooned to $11 billion company-wide upon full review. Their June 19th presentation to the board, with Ebbers uncharacteristically silent in the room, triggered the confession 2 days later, sending shockwaves that felled Andersen and reformed auditing forever. Yet the true legacy of Ebbers' fraud stretches into 2025, like a long shadow over today's telecom landscape, where echoes of WorldCom's inflated assets manifest in subtle but sinister ways. From 5G hype bubbles to AI-driven accounting risks that threaten to repeat history on a grander scale. Fast forward 23 years, and while Sarbanes-Oxley has fortified balance sheets with Section 404 internal controls and PCAOB oversight, a fresh wave of DOJ retrospectives and shareholder lawsuits, filed as recently as April 2025 against WorldCom's surviving auditors and execs, have unearthed lingering $180 billion in unrecovered losses, with victims like the Mississippi PERS pension fund still clawing back pennies on the dollar through class actions that spotlight how the scandal's ripples cost taxpayers billions in bailouts and reforms. In the USA, where telecom giants like Verizon and AT&T now dominate with $300 billion market caps, the Ebbers playbook lives on in modern guises. Aggressive revenue recognition in spectrum auctions, where carriers capitalize massive 5G investments as indefinite-lived intangibles to mask operating shortfalls, or off-balance sheet leases for data centers that echo WorldCom's line cost tricks, drawing SEC scrutiny in ongoing probes of T-Mobile's 2024 merger accounting. Ebbers himself, from his prison cell until his 2022 death, symbolized unrepentant hubris, refusing to testify at trial and blaming aggressive accounting rather than outright lies. But his fraud's DNA is in today's scandals, like the 2025 FTX fallout's asset misclassification, or even big tech's ad revenue manipulations, where quarterly pressures still tempt CFOs to blur expense lines for stock pops. The human cost compounds the financial. 20,000 WorldCom jobs vanished in the bankruptcy, pensions evaporated for families who'd bet their futures on Ebbers' vision, and whistleblower Cooper, hailed as a hero, faced death threats that forced her into hiding. Her story immortalized in books and films as a cautionary beacon. As 2025's AI tools promise to automate audits with blockchain ledgers and anomaly detection, the Ebbers Echo warns that no tech can outpace human greed. Regulators like the SEC now mandate real-time disclosures under 2024's clawback rule, yanking bonuses from fraud-tainted execs. But the temptation endures. Who wouldn't reclassify $1 billion to save their ranch? In the end, WorldCom's $11 billion mirage wasn't just a ledger lie. It was a mirror to corporate America's soul, reflecting how far we'll stretch truth for the illusion of invincibility. And in 2025, as new bubbles inflate in quantum computing and metaverse infrastructure, the lesson rings louder than ever. Without vigilance, the next Ebbers is already dialing in.